All right, so as Mitch said, my name is Brian Bagzis. I'm actually from the Philadelphia area. I run the local chapter of Skeptics in the Pub there. And this is my fourth time here at SkeptiCamp. Back in 2016, I talked about economics. 2017, I talked about technological progress. 2018, I talked about political science. And so this time I'm talking about foreign policy. And it's kind of cool to have a skeptical take on the social sciences as well. And so my talk is entitled An Introduction to the Liberal International Order and a more rational alternative to New World Order conspiracy theories. So let's see. Yes, okay. So first off, I think it's important to say, you know, when we ever have questions about a certain domain, well, where do we start? What domain of expertise do we start with? And so for foreign policy, that's going to be international relations. And that's an interdisciplinary field that studies the behavior of nation states as well as intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations and multinational corporations, and the wider world system produced by their interactions. So most IR scholars, we're talking about people in academia, are positivists. And what that means is they approach the field as social scientists. They try to uncover trends and patterns. You know, it's a very complex system they're dealing with. They're trying to be as empirical as they can. And there's several different major IR paradigms, schools of thought. So the first two are realist and liberal. These are basically the two major ones. And so realists, it's a rational, positivist approach. They focus on interstate conflict, especially war. And both realists and liberals tend to use game theory. So realists tend to look at like win-lose situations, right? Wars off guard. Whereas liberals tend to try to look at win-win situations. And so they're more focused on interstate cooperation. Specifically trade, for example, the benefits that countries can get via trade is to go and work each other. And then there's two others that are what we might call post-positivist, because their scholars are kind of much more skeptical of the idea that you can be empirical of the world system. They tend to kind of just be more theoretical and don't even try to involve empirics as much. That's not true of all of them, though. And those are called constructivists and the critical or neo-Marxist IR scholars. So the constructivists, they focus much more on the role of culture and social psychology. So the game theoretical model, they tend to see that as kind of a very modern, Western, you know, rationalistic worldview. They think, you know, honestly, there's so much irrationality and culture shapes, you know, the way that people look at things, and the social psychology of masses of people focuses, shifts us away from kind of a game theoretic perspective. So I think there's something probably to that. And the neo-Marxist view is more focused on, as you probably expect, economic exploitation dynamics. You know, so core periphery. You know, I mean that you have these kind of core developed nations or these periphery nations that are kind of still developing or underdeveloped, where the resources come from, and they tend to see this as like a exploitative, imperialistic type dynamic. So those are the four schools of thought. So the first thing I think we should ask ourselves after we just understand what international relations or IR is what is the expert consensus and how skeptical should we be of it? So we can determine the IR consensus from polls of IR scholars. So the College of William & Mary has this program that's called the TRIP program. TRIP is an acronym. I forget exactly what it stands for. But they have regularly polled thousands of American IR scholars since 2014. So you can check this out. That's the link right there if you want to see these polls and kind of get a general sense of what most IR scholars believe. One thing that you'll immediately see is that even when you break the questions down by those four different paradigms I gave you, there's a surprising amount of agreement between liberals, realists, constructivists, and even the Marxists. I was very surprised by that. They see a lot of issues in the same way. It doesn't vary nearly as much as you think. So how skeptical should we be of it? IR scholars have far more descriptive knowledge of foreign policy than most lay people. But Philip Tetlock, and he's the guy that wrote that book right there, Super Forecasting. He's a UPenn professor of political science, and he's done research testing the predictability of various people who might be considered geopolitics experts. That's not just IR scholars, it's economists, various foreign policy experts in government, things like that. And he talks about it in his book, Expert Political Judgment. 2005, and he found out that the predictive ability for things like elections, wars, economic crashes, etc., it's often no better than chance. However, of course, he was asking them very difficult questions. So if you look at, like, there's polls of the late American public where they sometimes try to pump people, and they'll ask people, you might have heard of this one, they ask the American public, should we bomb Agrabah? Agrabah, for those who don't know, is the fictional capital city in the movie Aladdin. And so then, they saw the left-right split, and then, Democrats said absolutely not, Republicans were like, hell yeah. And, they had no idea that the city, the vast majority of people were basically, it was foreign sounding, probably Arabic, should we bomb them or not? It was surprising how many few people said, I don't know. So, IR scholars know a hell of a lot more than any of those people do, all right? They would immediately know the answer to that question is, okay, you're trying to pump me. But when we get into really tough things, like, what will be the outcome of, the, this or that climate talks, or, this upcoming election or something like that, these are very hard questions. So I don't think we should fault them too much for not knowing how to predict it. But experiments with geopolitical forecasting trends, and also the development of sophisticated computer models may change this in the near future. We might actually get better at predictions. So the super forecasting book right there, that is from 2015. As Phil Tellock did these kind of forecasting experiments where they actually found people who could kind of work through these problems analytically and did a little bit better than chance. And even like 60% of the time they got the correct. So that's significant. Even the intelligence agencies who were sponsoring it were very impressed. There's an earlier book by Bruce Wayne called The Predictioneer's Game. He talks about basically using these game theoretic models, and you look at, like, basically not just the executive, but all the advisors and power brokers in each country, and you kind of try to model their interests in this kind of very sophisticated multi-vector analysis, game theoretical analysis, and it's still controversial, but it was interesting. It was an interesting book. So I think that we might be seeing better predictive abilities from IR in the near future. Nevertheless, the empirical questions IR scholars raise tend to be important issues, and they at least give us a starting point. And most IR scholars see democracy promotion, trade deals, military alliances, and multilateral institutions as part of something called the liberal international order. And this was basically kind of put in place after World War II to prevent World War III. And so we should probably take this seriously. If you're concerned about existential risk or anything like that, this kind of fits in with that. Also, reading and research from IR scholars gives us the background knowledge we need to debunk conspiracy theories about foreign policy, like the idea of secret plots to institute a totalitarian world government, aka the New World Order. So if you want to debunk the Alex Jones and David Icke kind of stuff, that's not too hard. You don't actually have to know that much about IR, because so many of the things they say are so wild. But there's a lot of people who are kind of putting out kind of what I call quasi-conspiracy theories that aren't on their face absurd, and so you kind of have to know a bit about IR to kind of assess them. All right, so what's the New World Order, aka NWO? Where did the conspiracy theories about secret plans for world government come from? So the phrase New World Order was actually used by Woodrow Wilson and others after World War I as part of their advocacy for the League of Nations, and principles like self-determination, collective security, free trade. And as most of you know, the U.S. did not enroll in the League of Nations, and it kind of flopped when we got World War II. So after World War II, the phrase New World Order was used to describe the effects of international institutions like the United Nations, NATO, the Bretton Woods system, the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and the Marshall Plan. These were all basically, New World Order Part 2, or as it came to be called, they tended not to use that terminology. They would call it various other things. They called it the liberal international order, the rules-based order, multilateralism, transatlanticism or Atlanticism, Pax Americana, the Washington Consensus, internationalism, globalism. You'll see these are they're not completely interchangeable. They have different shades of meaning, but these are all kind of similar terms that our scholars will use to talk about the net effect of all these international institutions. So conspiracy theories about a secret plan for a totalitarian world government appear to have started among paleoconservatives. That's what we call it, the old right. Like the John Birch Society during the Second Red Scare, so we're talking like late 40s, early 50s. And this gave rise to a cottage industry of these New World Order conspiracy theory books and pamphlets that demonized the UN, NATO, World Bank, and IMF, as well as the think tanks and non-governmental organizations that supported the liberal international order. They were very isolationist, they were totally against this. And you even saw some people trying to kind of connect these institutions, this new world order, with older conspiracy theories about like the protocols of the Elders of Zion, or the Catholic Church, or the Freemasons, and stuff like that. And it got to be crazy. So while most NWO conspiracy theorists are right-wing and fear creeping socialism and an erosion of American sovereignty, there's also left-wing conspiracy theorists who see the liberal international order as basically a front for crony capitalism and American imperialism. So you get it on the right and the left. Lyndon LaRouche is an interesting guy. He was actually a notable example of a conspiracy theorist who kind of blended ideas from both the political right and left and kind of varied them over time. In 2013, in case you're wondering how this breaks down, public policy polling found that about 28% of Americans claim to believe that, quote, a secretive power elite with a globalist agenda is conspiring to eventually rule the world through territorial government or new world order. And another 25% said they're not sure. Whatever that's worth. Now there's a strong partisan bent to these beliefs. 34% of Republicans and 35% of independents, only 15% of Democrats said they believe in the New World Order. So what do NWO conspiracy theories, why do they often focus on think tanks and secret societies? You ever notice that? You hear about the Council on Foreign Relations and the Thebilderbergers and, you know, the Illuminati. And so the historian Niall Ferguson, whose book I have right here, suggests that foreign policy emerges from both formal hierarchical institutions, which he calls towers, and informal networks, which he calls squares. And he points out that most historians have neglected the role of informal associations, which has left kind of a theory vacuum, and allowed conspiracy theorists to monopolize the discussion until now. Now he actually brings in some new tools historians are using in social network analysis, and that's a new research approach to understanding the power of informal associations. And it suggests that informal discussions frame the quote-unquote respectable policy options. You might have heard that called the Overton window. But it doesn't really directly dictate policy, because that would run into problems with diverging interests between people from different countries, or people, you know, different powers and influences within the same country, and you have all kinds of coordination problems. But it's just more framing the issue. So, like my picture there. What does the Boogie Grove have to do with NWO? How many people have heard of the Boogie Grove? Raise your hand up. All right. Actually, okay, so some people, but a lot of people have not heard of it. So the Bohemian Club, the Grove is where they celebrate. The Bohemian Club is actually the name of the group. It was founded way back in 1872 in San Francisco. It was a social club for artists, writers, musicians, you know, theater folks, who held an annual gathering on a private campground called Bohemian Grove. And then they would invite a few wealthy patrons to help, you know, fund their stuff there. So it's kind of like, you know, the 19th century version of Burning Man in a way. And by the early 20th century, they just kept inviting more and more wealthy patrons. You kind of see this happen in Burning Man, you know, where after a while you have these kind of plug-and-play camps, and they're kind of boxing the rest of the people out. So eventually, a lot of the artists leave, and it's mostly dominated by these kind of mostly Republican politicians and wealthy businessmen. And there's some leftover pageantry, like this cremation of hair ritual. This is on the opening day. There's this big statue of an owl, and they burn this empty coffin. You know, this is supposed to represent the kind of them letting go of their care or something like that. Alex Jones snuck in back in the year 2000 with the journalist John Ronson and told everyone this was like a human sacrifice they were doing. Yeah, so there's these kind of leftover elements of pageantry, like the cremation hair ritual, and then throughout the celebration they have these amateur plays they put on called hijinks. Some of the people do like drag shows and stuff, and then, you know, Alex Jones said that was gay rituals that they were doing, and tried to link that to them trafficking male prostitutes in from San Francisco, and got really weird with it. But really, it doesn't seem that this has any kind of formal discussions of foreign policy. You won't really hear IR scholars talk about it, because it's not, you know, there are occasionally foreign dignitaries there, but it's not even really bipartisan. It's mostly just a bunch of rich Republicans camping for 2 weeks and getting drunk. And several things suggest they have less power than conspiracy theorists think. One is in 1984, they lost a lawsuit alleging sex discrimination against employees. They used to have all male employees. They lost that. And they had to hire women in there. they had some excuse like, well, we like to pee on trees a lot or something like that. We like to just nature pee, and it's going to be a problem if women are there, so they lost that suit. In 2007, they actually struggled to get a logging permit on their own property. And then in 2016, Colin Powell, if some of you might remember this, his emails were hacked. And he had gone to Boogie Grove, he's talked about it in his emails. He ran into Stephen Harper there and talked a little bit about that. But the key thing is that he said that almost like there's one guy there among the Bohemians who was like, in favor of Trump. Everybody else wanted anyone but Trump to win. But of course, I mean, they couldn't even rig their own party's nomination. So I think that should make us a little skeptical about how powerful they are. The next group you might have heard of is the CFR, Council on Foreign Relations. So they're founded in 1921. They emerged from Woodrow Wilson's Inquiry, which is a think tank that was trying to put together the League of Nations. And as most of you know, that didn't work out. But after World War II, it was still around and emerged as one of the more prominent think tanks in foreign policy. So in 2018, there's this global go-to think tank index, and if you rank the CFR 10th in terms of its influence, you can see that it's on there. It's important, but there's a lot of other ones. And conspiracy theorists, I think, mostly neglect the influence of these other think tanks, focusing on the CFR just due to its age, that it was already controversial back around the time of the League of Nations. And so they've just heard about it and they obsess about it over and over again. And they're not really good at thinking about how policy emerges from a network like this, and a whole bunch of different think tanks all kind of vying for control. Last year, the CFR president, Richard Haas, actually lamented Trump's foreign policy in an article entitled How a World Ends. And he was interviewed by NPR about it and talked about it. And he said that the CFR backed the Iran nuclear deal that was brokered by the Obama administration, TTP trade deal, the Syrian civil war intervention, and he was really upset that the Trump administration was pulling back on all these things. But that should show you that, I mean, their power is probably fairly limited if they can't kind of impose it on the Trump administration. So the Bilderberg group, who here has heard of the Bilderbergers? Okay, many more people have heard of the Bilderbergers. So they were actually started in 1954 by a Polish politician in exile, Joseph Ratzinger, to promote transatlantic cooperation in the Cold War. He was afraid about some anti-Americanism that might prevent the Europeans in Western Europe from working with the US in the Cold War, but also just some tensions among Europeans. He wanted to see greater integration in Europe. He was really afraid of another, one, he wanted the West to win the Cold War, but he was also afraid of like World War III happening. So it's controversial because its meetings are closed to the press, and it records it by using the Chatham House rules, which just basically means that even when they record minutes, the speakers are anonymous. So there was a major league of Bilderberg meeting records in 2010, and really not much was uncovered. I saw a Skeptoid podcast, Brian Dunning's Skeptoid podcast covered it. I saw YouTubers and this, conspiracy theory guys covered it. They were trying to really make a mountain out of a molehill, but there was really not much there. So the most embarrassing things they came up with was, well, the notes showed that they were talking about European integration and common currency for a long time before the EU. Okay, so what? But to them the EU's bad, so they made a lot about that. Because they think that, oh, well, therefore we're going to have a North American Union and an Amero, currency. And in 2002, they said that Donald Rumsfeld went there and discussed the impending Iraq invasion. But the thing is that notes suggest that people were basically kind of didn't know whether to believe that Saddam actually still had WMDs. We knew he had them back in the 80s and early 90s, and kind of weapons in use on Iran and the Kurds. They didn't know, they figured he was trying to get nukes. But you don't really see, there was no smoking gun there. They're just kind of discussing what we should do about Iraq. And another thing that was interesting is you'll hear a lot about, if you listen to this conspiracy theory stuff about Bilderberg, about Obama sneaking off the Bilderberg meeting in 2008. It was in Virginia. And, but this is basically Bilderberg participation by use of administration officials. And you can see, this is the number of people that different presidents and different administrations sent. And you can see there's nobody in 2013, 2014. So apparently by then he just figured it was kind of so pointless he didn't even bother sending anyone. So that kind of makes me wonder how important he really thought the Bilderberg meetings were. Also in 2012, Alex Jones and other conspiracy theorists, they were claiming that because Marco Rubio went to the Summit of the Americas conference, the Bilderbergers were going to tell Mitt Romney to pick Rubio as his VP running mate. So that didn't really work out. So even if the New World Order isn't tightly controlled, how do we know it's not that harmful? So we have to look at these components. There's democracy promotion, free trade agreements, military alliances, and multilateral institutions. And so if you look at the polls IR scholars, according to the TRIP program that I cited earlier, strong majorities see military alliances, trade deals, and participation in international agreements and multilateral institutions as keys to achieving U.S. foreign policy goals. And also, according to a poll last year, over 95% said that multilateral institutions erected after World War II provide significant benefits to the U.S. So they might all be wrong, but this is, the expert consensus probably deserves some level of deference. So we can break this down. So does promoting democracy decrease the risk of major wars? So you might have heard of democratic peace theory. This is the idea that no two democracies have ever gone to war with each other. It's not entirely true. It kind of depends on how you define democracy, new democracies versus old democracies and stuff. But there's a variety of reasons, I think, that might be less likely to go to war. So leaders are more accountable for casualties. The public, their war readiness is more transparent to other nations. There's a culture of contracts that discourages wars of aggression. The empirical data suggests that democracies are less likely to go to war with each other, but they're not necessarily less likely to go to war with autocracies and non-democracies. And these reasons up here kind of would make you think that democracies would be less likely to go to war, period. So it's still kind of an open question. Does free trade deals, that's the other thing they talk about, does that increase the risk of major wars? So there's this thing called capitalist peace theory that suggests that once you have really developed markets, trade is more beneficial to war, they're not as likely to fight with each other. Thomas Friedman had this thing called the golden arches theory, which is that no two nations with McDonald's would go to war with each other. It's kind of a tongue-in-cheek thing. It was falsified by the Russians' invasion of Ukraine in 2014, but empirically it does look to many IR scholars like the growth of global trade networks after World War II played a role in the decreasing frequency of major wars. Basically, it's easier to trade than it is to try to invade and occupy a country and steal their resources. Lastly, does a policeman of the world backed by military alliances decrease the risk of major wars? Another kind of open question in IR. So there's this thing called hegemonic stability theory. Basically states that a world hegemon, a world power, can act as a policeman of the world, kind of punish nations that act aggressively. That might tamp down wars, or at least major world wars. But it's kind of split. Some people also think that major regional powers, balance of powers, might be better. And there's also this thing called extended deterrence theory that states that military alliances deter armed conflict by signaling that it's high risk, high cost of potential adversaries. However, the steps to war hypothesis maintains that those alliances could actually provoke a war like World War II, where there's a kind of a chain reaction, from the shooting of Archduke in Sarajevo, in Sarajevo to all nations piling into a huge World War. It's kind of an open question. So in conclusion, so I tried to briefly describe how IR scholars think about the world international order, but many scientific skeptics will not really probably think much of their arguments and will note that they have these disagreements with each other. Probably figure we should just dismiss it all as non-scientific. But is that the logical conclusion? So last year I actually quoted the economist Adam Osmek. He talked about how lay people are often too ready to dismiss the opinions of economists and other social scientists as non-scientific, so they can just kind of hold on to their pre-existing beliefs. And his reply, I think, bears repeating. If you're going to hold social science research to a very high burden of proof, then you should be prepared to subject all your beliefs to such a standard. What this will leave you with is mostly weak beliefs for a lot of stuff that matters to you, whether it be about medicine, history, psychology, criminal justice, climate science, or economics. Maybe widespread weak beliefs are a better approximation of truth. I don't know. But I do know very few people do or are willing to reason like that consistently. Maybe they should, but even here, the vast majority of humanity has more belief changing to do than social scientists. So in conclusion, be skeptical, but not too skeptical. Thank you.
It's Q&A time, I assume, yeah. So yeah, you might have questions for me.
Yes.
Illuminati, sometimes I also hear Freemasons. Is that just an American thing, or is that...
So my understanding is that the Bavarian Illuminati were an actual secret society in Bavaria, in Germany, in the late 18th century, early 19th century. They were trying to kind of foment the democratic revolution there, and that failed. They were banned. And so conspiracy theorists think they still exist, but mainstream historians say they don't exist. Freemasons are a real group. It used to be kind of like a more prestigious kind of fraternal organization, a lot of founding fathers involved in it. It doesn't seem to have much influence here in the 20th century, any more than like the Moose Lodge or Elks Lodge or something. Yes?
There's a think tank, I think it's the Heritage Foundation, or maybe the American Heritage Foundation.
I did not mention it, but the Heritage Foundation is a think tank, yeah.
I think those are more of a threat than the older groups. Like the older group doesn't really do anything.
So let me go back to the think tank ranking. So, where is it? What's it far? There we go. So are they a threat? I mean, they're basically just talking to each other. And so there's conservative and liberal and centrist think tanks. And then out of a whole bunch of them, this is kind of how most scholars think of it. You have a whole bunch of think tanks, they're all talking. You kind of try to map who belongs to what think tanks and what positions they hold. And the social network analysis that now Fergus is doing, is, not just him, other scholars, is trying to kind of figure out, okay, how does this all produce a consensus around foreign policy? But it's, you know, thousands of people talking at think tanks is different than the stereotypical view of like 10 guys in a smoky back room around, you know, the big table deciding how the world's going to work. Yes?
On your table 22, top international development policy think tanks, how would it be weighed? How do you know that the Korea Development Institute is #1 and CFR is #2?
Do you know what? So I don't work in this field. I did a meetup on this like 6 months ago. So if you asked me right then, I like don't want to look at these indexes, but I looked at it then, and I remember it was like a whole bunch of different criteria, and they're weighting them. And so the cool thing is you can at least go to the global, go to think tank index, and you can look at their criteria.
Okay.
And then you can say, oh, their criteria aren't that good, I would use these criteria instead, and then you can see if you shifted it, how it would shift the rankings. But at least this is kind of a cool, semi-empirical way to look at, okay, how do we determine influence, as opposed to just kind of narrowly focusing on the CFR or some of the things.
Which, just in case you remember, did any one criteria make an impression on you?
I think it looked at like how many people were, you know, current or former members of like the federal government, you know, in the United States or over in Europe and stuff like that. I think they even looked at like, you know, how many citations their reports were getting and like citation ranking and stuff
just
like
that.
Just
like an academic paper or something.
Kind of similar to that, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else? Yes?
So, I guess there's as you mentioned, there's these conspiracy theories out there about New World Order. How much influence do the people with those conspiracy theories have on world?
So that's interesting. How the Alex Joneses and stuff like that. So from what I've read is that it was not that much in the 20th century, because you had a few TV channels where you had these kind of gatekeeping major newspapers that could kind of push these people to the fringes. And they had a hard time getting a voice. They can't get on TV, they can't really get on the radio except maybe 2 in the morning or something like that. They're not going to get an article in the New York Times, so they just couldn't really get their message out there. These newsletters and pamphlets and stuff they would try to send out. With the internet, that's really changed things. I think that's given people like Alex Jones a much wider reach. And I think that part of it is that also that we're kind of in a realm of political polarization that makes people more likely to kind of think that the elites are doing something really bad and more likely to buy into it. I also think that conspiracy theories are also sexier than like the mainstream scholarly interpretation. They're cooler, they appeal more to like the kind of gut instinct of the average person. They're exciting, you know, they have great basis for movies. So I think that that's why they have much more reach today.
They have more reach, but how much in terms of actually changing?
Oh, so yeah, so I think there's probably been research done on it. I can't quote it off the top of my head, but I think that there has been, and this goes back to the 70s, a decline in trust in institutions in America. So you can see this from Gallup and Pew Research polls. And so this might play a part of it. I mean, there's other things, obviously, that, you know, different scandals and stuff like that probably play a role. But I would say that really, once you get into the 2000s, that the conspiracy theories, probably the 9/11 stuff, and obviously, you remember like when Obama was president, all the birth of conspiracy theories and stuff like that. It was a really politicians were talking about. It was a way to get people to hate him, you know. And so I think that it's more